The tent was cut from the inside. That's the detail investigators kept returning to, the one that refuses to sit comfortably alongside any tidy explanation. 9 hikers, deep in the frozen Ural Mountains, had sliced their way out of their own shelter in the middle of a February night in temperatures far below freezing, and run into the darkness without their coats, without their boots, some of them without much clothing at all. They didn't come back. This is the story of what happened on the slopes of a mountain the local Mansi people called the Mountain of the Dead. Decades later, with the case file long since declassified, with the bodies exhumed and re-examined, with modern forensic science brought to bear on 9 deaths from 1959, we still don't have a single answer that explains everything. We have pieces, we have a timeline, and we have a mystery that has outlived the Soviet Union itself. To understand what happened, you have to understand who these 9 people were. They weren't reckless amateurs. They were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, experienced winter hikers led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. The group would eventually bear his name, though at the time they simply called it a ski trek, a Category 3 route, the most difficult grade in the Soviet hiking classification system, planned to cross the northern Urals and summit a mountain called Otorten. In late January of 1959, 10 hikers set out by train, then truck, then on foot, into a region that was remote even by Soviet standards. One of them, Yuri Yudin, turned back early after his chronic health problems flared up. That decision saved his life. He would spend the rest of his own life as the last person to see the other 9 alive, and as a man who spent decades trying to understand why he was the one who lived. The remaining 9 pushed on. 5 men, 2 women, all experienced outdoorsmen and outdoorswomen in their early 20s, disciplined, well-equipped for the standards of the era, and following a route they had planned meticulously. Their diaries and photographs, recovered later, show a group in good spirits, jokes, songs around the fire, no sign of dread. On the 1st of February, they began climbing the slope of a mountain that would later be renamed Kolatsiakhl, which in the Mansi language is often translated as Mountain of the Dead, a name it held long before any of this happened, tied to older local tragedies and folklore, not to this incident. Because of worsening weather, they made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Rather than descend to the tree line for better shelter, they pitched their tent directly on the open slope, apparently intending to get an early start the next morning. That tent became the last known scene of 9 ordinary lives. What we know after this point comes from a patchwork of physical evidence: the tent itself, footprints in the snow, the positions and condition of the bodies, forensic autopsy reports, and the investigative case file opened by Soviet authorities. When the hikers failed to check in on their expected date, a search was launched. It took until the 26th of February for searchers to find the tent, half collapsed under snow, on the slope of Kolatsiakhl. It had been cut open from the inside. Skis were still stacked outside as a makeshift porch. Boots were left behind. Warm coats still folded inside. Whatever drove 9 experienced winter hikers to slash their way out of a sturdy tent, in temperatures that likely sat between 15 and 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, it was something they judged more dangerous than the cold itself. Footprints, some in socks, some barefoot, some in a single shoe, led away from the tent toward the tree line more than a kilometer below. The prints showed no signs of struggle at the campsite, no signs of a chaotic chase, just a steady, deliberate retreat down the mountain, into the forest, into the dark. At the tree line, Searchers found the remains of a small fire, and near it, the bodies of two of the hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonashenko, dressed only in underwear, despite the extreme cold. Nearby, the body of Igor Dyatlov himself was found, seemingly making his way back up toward the tent. Not far away, Zenaida Kolmogorova, also apparently trying to return, and the body of Rustem Slobodin, who had a fractured skull, though one that investigators did not initially consider severe enough on its own to be fatal. The autopsies concluded that these first four discovered had died primarily of hypothermia. It took until May, when the snow finally began to melt, for searchers to find the remaining four. They were discovered in a ravine, under several meters of snow, further into the forest. And this is where the case turns from tragic to deeply strange. 3 of these 4 had catastrophic injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had a fractured skull. Ludmila Dubanina and Alexander Zolotaryov had severe chest fractures, the kind of blunt force trauma, according to the medical examiner, that would typically be associated with a high-speed car crash. And yet there was no external bruising or breaks in the skin consistent with a beating or a fall onto rock. One investigator at the time compared the force required to that of a vehicle impact, while noting the complete absence of the kind of soft tissue damage you'd expect from a direct blow. Dubanina was also missing her tongue, along with her eyes, part of her lips, and some facial tissue. This detail, more than perhaps any other, fueled decades of speculation, though forensic experts have since pointed to a more mundane, if unsettling, explanation. Bodies submerged in a running stream over months of decomposition, exposed to small scavengers and to natural post-mortem degradation, can sustain exactly this kind of soft tissue loss. The official Soviet investigation, concluded in May of 1959, closed the case with a strikingly vague verdict, that the hikers died as a result of a compelling natural force. The files were sealed, and for decades the entire matter received little public attention beyond quiet rumor. So what actually happened up on that mountain? The most widely supported explanation among modern investigators centers on an avalanche, though not the kind of dramatic, cinematic snowslide the word usually conjures. Researchers studying the slope's angle, snow composition, and the specific way the tent had been cut and partially buried have proposed what's sometimes called a slab avalanche, a smaller, localized slide of packed snow that could occur on a slope not steep enough to trigger a typical avalanche warning. A team of Swiss and Russian researchers, publishing analysis using modern snow slab modeling in 2021, argued this type of delayed slide was physically plausible given the terrain and the way the hikers had cut into the slope to pitch their tent, potentially explaining the blunt trauma to some victims without leaving external bruising, since a compacting snow slab can crush without the kind of impact that breaks skin. Critics of the avalanche theory point out that the placement and condition of the tent when it was found didn't show classic avalanche burial patterns, and that if snow had struck with such force, it's unclear why other hikers in the same tent escaped serious injury entirely. Supporters respond that the theory doesn't require a large or dramatic slide, only a small, localized displacement, enough to injure a few unlucky sleepers and terrify the entire group into a panicked, poorly judged retreat into sub-zero darkness. Other theories have circulated over the decades. Some point to katabatic winds, extreme localized windstorms known to occur in mountainous terrain, capable of frightening people out of a shelter and causing severe hypothermia. Others have suggested infrasound, low-frequency sound waves generated by wind moving across the mountain's contours, theorized to cause disorientation or panic, though this remains speculative and difficult to test conclusively after the fact. Then there are the theories that lean toward Cold War intrigue. that the group stumbled into a secret military test, possibly involving experimental weaponry, and that the injuries and the strange condition of some clothing, which testing showed had elevated but not unusual levels of radioactivity, point to a cover-up. Investigators who support the natural cause explanations note that some radioactive trace elements in that era were commonly used in certain lens coatings and consumer goods, and that a full-scale military cover-up is difficult to reconcile with the fact that Soviet authorities allowed an investigation, a burial with honors, and eventual quiet contact with grieving families. Russian prosecutors reopened the case in 2019 at the request of victims' relatives, and their conclusion in 2020 pointed to an avalanche as the most probable cause, though this reinvestigation has not fully settled public or scientific debate. What remains undisputed is this: 9 people, capable and prepared, made a decision in the middle of the night that led them to their deaths. Whatever they saw, heard, or felt inside that tent was frightening enough to override every instinct of survival and self-preservation that had gotten them safely through that mountain range in the first place. The physical evidence tells us a great deal. The cuts in the tent fabric, the direction of the footprints, the injuries, the makeshift fire, the desperate climb back up the slope by some, the retreat further down by others. But it cannot fully tell us why. It cannot recreate the fear in that tent in the seconds before the knife came out. Science can explain how bodies might fracture without bruising. It cannot fully explain the specific human terror that sent 9 people into a Ural winter night wearing socks instead of boots. More than 6 decades later, the Dyatlov Pass remains one of the rare cases where the forensic record is extensive, the investigation was real and documented, and yet consensus still doesn't exist. The avalanche theory has the strongest scientific backing today, but strongest is not the same as certain. The mountain keeps at least part of its answer. If stories like this one, grounded in real evidence, honest about their unknowns, are the kind of mystery you want more of, subscribe to The True Unknown and join us for the next case history has never quite closed.